Hello, and today we're going to go over the second chapter of Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. In the previous chapter, Arendt goes over the common misconceptions of what anti-Semitism is, and what she argues is that we must understand anti-Semitism from a historical context. It's in this chapter that she goes over the political historical context of the Jews and then their relation to the state and society. She does this by outlining 4 different phases that starts from the 17th century and goes all the way until the end of the 19th century. The first phase occurs in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the idea of the nation-state started to grow under the tutelage of absolute monarchs. Individual Jews rose out of obscurity and into the privileged positions of the court Jew, who financed state affairs. Princes and monarchs, each in their own household, had a court Jew, and this court Jew was responsible for handling financial projects, usually one-off projects, nothing that was sustained over time. In compensation, the court Jews received both protection and privileges from the princes and the monarchs. Over time, as these small feudal lords, monarchs, and princes increased their power over the region, Jews were elevated into a higher financial position. And however, according to Arendt, the Jews didn't use this extra power in a political sense. The Jews merely saw this as a business transaction. Now later in this chapter, we'll go over how this relationship between the state and the Jews was often a source of anti-Semitism by society. As the small feudal lords started gaining more power, the court Jews that financed them also rose in position and privilege. However, the Jews didn't use this additional power and privilege in order to force political power. What they did is that they simply scoped down their relationship to princes and kings to merely a business transaction. Now, over time, the monarchy sought out a class to identify itself with the government or to replace the nobility. At the end of the 18th century, it was clear that none of the classes were willing to support them. The classes thought that the monarchy's business ventures was not productive, and they would rather stay in a capitalist private market. This failure led to the development of the nation-state, or class above all the classes, which led to the second phase that we're going to talk about now. Now, the second phase starts after the French Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century, when modern nation-states started to arise. Nation-states deepened the split between what it meant to be in society versus what it meant to be in the state. This emergence of nation-states also called for something that was new that had never been seen before: emancipation of all the social classes. This means that all the classes would be equally free before the law. But in order to endeavor on such a project and to establish this new edict of emancipation, they required more money in business for the state to basically execute these actions. But none of the classes wanted to fund the state, and so the state looked to the court Jews in order to fund this financial project. But the court Jews have never financed anything so large, and so in order to actually fund the whole project, the court Jews went out to wealthier Jewish families and got them to be part of the business deal. Now, what happened here is that the privileges that were given to the court Jews were also extended to the wealthier families in the Jewish wealth strata in Western and Central Europe. Now, there's an ironic thing about this, because the reason for passing these edicts was for that everybody within society to have equal rights. However, in order to execute this edict, you needed a special state machine or Jews to give money in order to fund the project. And to compensate the Jews, they got special privileges, which is against the idea of equality. As a result, there was a separation between what it meant to be Jewish. You had the rich Jews who worked with the state, and they received special privileges like equality. And then you had the less well-off Jews that lived in the ghettos that didn't get these privileges. It was this compensation idea that the rich Jews got about equality that made it such that the Emancipation edicts didn't target Jews that were less well-off and did not interact with the state. This changed the relationship between the Jews and the state, and Arendt writes, "What in the 17th and 18th centuries had been an unorganized connection among individual Jews of different countries now became a more systematic disposition of these scattered opportunities by a single firm, physically present in all important European capitals." The best example of this is the House of Rothschild, and this is one of the most wealthy families that funded most of the state projects in the 19th century. And this Jewish family established an international presence in multiple capitals all around the European continent. When society thought of what it meant to be in a Jewish family, they often thought about the Rothschilds. a tight-knit, rich, state-embedded international organization. Arendt writes, "We find the Jews always represented as an international trade organization, a worldwide family concerned with identical interests everywhere. A secret force behind the throne which degrades all visible governments into mere facade, or into marionettes whose strings are manipulated from behind the scenes." But this is wrong. The Jews were just simply doing business transactions with the state, and they had no desire for power. The third phase marks the age of imperialism. Imperialism became more relevant when the private capitalistic ventures of businessmen and the bourgeoisie started extending beyond the boundaries of the nation. For example, there were resources in Africa, and in order to obtain and protect those resources, they required the state and military in order to basically keep and be stationed there so that they can always get access to those resources. Thus, the bourgeoisie and the businessman started a new economical relationship between the state. This made it such that the Jews were no longer the sole lender to the state finances, and thus their power over state finances decreased over time. However, the Jews played another role. They weren't just the bankers of the state. They were also an inter-European element, which means that since they were around all of the European continent, they provided a communication channel for nations to discuss certain things like peace treaties, wars, international trade agreements, etc. Now, the fourth phase marks the decline of the nation-states themselves. Imperialism changed the concept of power. It was no longer about military might, it was about who had the most wealth. In order to maximize profits, state was pushed aside and anything was done in order to get more money, and thus the political and the foreign policy of the nation-state started to decline. Since the last role of the Jews was an inter-European element that helped foreign policy between national governments, this new imperialistic way of being a nation started to erode on that role. This left the Jews to play no role in either state or society. However, they amassed much wealth through their previous activities, and so when society looked at them, they saw that there was this kind of independent entity within their country that was foreign and that did not contribute either to society or the state, and this is where a lot of anti-Semitism springs in the 20th century. So to recap, we had in the 17th and 18th centuries of the first phase, feudal monarchs who hired court Jews in order to finance their one-off projects. After the French Revolution, nation-states started to emerge and wanted to produce equality, but this project required lots of money, and the court Jews couldn't finance this, so they extended the reach to other wealthier Jewish families in order to finance the state. This basically gave more Jewish families in the wealthier area more privileges than even some in society. However, imperialism came about, and the state no longer needed to lean on the Jews for money. The businessmen and the bourgeoisie who had capitalistic ventures outside the nation were also willing to give the government money in order to fund their ventures. Over time, money became more important than government, and the decline of nation-states occurred, and since the role of the Jews as the inter-European element was the last thing that they were holding on to, at least with their relationship to the state, this declined, and they were basically left into a void, yet they still amassed their wealth through the previous activities that they were a part of. Now, after Arendt analyzes these four phases, she identifies specific instances of anti-Semitism throughout the period. And it's important to note that Arendt says that anti-Semitism really only comes about when there's political conflicts. Again, the Jews and their social connections were very small amongst society, however, they had large connection to the state. And so whenever there was an issue between the society and the state, society most of the time blamed Jews, or at least anti-Semitism rose during those times. The first anti-Semitic parties rose in the end of the 19th century. Financial scandals in Germany, France, Austria affected the lower middle class. Now, this was the artisans, this was the tradesmen, who previous to imperialism or capitalism had their businesses, and competition was very small, so they didn't have to adapt. However, when imperialism and capitalism came about, there was more competition, and they needed to fight for their existence. Much of these craftsmen and tradesmen wanted to keep their business alive. In order to do that, they needed to loan money, and they loaned money from the Jewish banker. Arendt writes, It is not difficult to comprehend that a man who put his money solely indirectly to the use of begetting more money can be hated more bitterly than the one who gets his profit through a lengthy and involved process of production. According to Arendt, the general figure of the banker bore Jewish traits for historical reasons. Arendt writes, "The social resentment of the lower middle classes against Jews turned into a highly explosive political element because these bitterly hated Jews were thought to be well on their way to political power." Again, a common misunderstanding of the society and Jews was that they thought the Jews were doing this in order to control the nation. And this is anything but the case. The Jews had their financial business and their business transactions, and they had no political motives. This lower middle class that thought the Jews were attempting to take power of the nation formed a mob, and political movements used anti-Semitism in order to activate these mobs. At first, parties weren't anti-Semitic and they just used anti-Semitic slogans, but once they found how effective the anti-Semitic slogans were for filling lecture halls full of people, new parties were established that were primarily anti-Semitic parties. The phrase Junkers and Jews came. This means that the Junkers were the nobility who owned much of the land, and the Jews who basically gave out credit to the peasants, and because the peasants depended on that credit. According to Arendt, these first anti-Semitic parties were unique for two reasons. One, they claimed to be a party above all parties. Arendt writes, "The anti-Semites' belief that their claim to exclusive rule was no more than what the Jews had already in fact achieved, gave them an advantage of a domestic program, and conditions were such that one had to enter this arena of social struggle in order to win political power." Second, they claimed to be a nation above all nations. Just as the Jews were represented as an inter-European element that didn't have a nation, the anti-Semitic parties basically portrayed themselves as the same thing, and it seems only logical that the enemies had to organize on the same principle. At the end of the 19th century, leftist anti-Semitic parties started to gain power. One is notably the Schoner labor movement, which used anti-Semitism to activate the lower middle class. This movement called for a new movement that was about pan-Germanism. So just as the Jews were a people and a race and a blood, there was this opposite that was the pan-German, and this idea was one of the ideas that Hitler used in order to activate the Nazi Party. According to Arendt, anti-Semitism in France was even more than in Germany. However, they didn't rise to power because they lacked the imperialistic element that the Germans had. They really kept everything within the state, and they had no ambitions to extend anti-Semitism beyond across Europe. One anti-Semite in France who wasn't taken so seriously but gives the general idea of what they thought, or he claimed that the Jews prevented the evolution of Europe into a political entity, had caused all European wars since 843, and had plotted to ruin both France and Germany by inciting their mutual hostility. One can only begin to imagine what propaganda was used in order to attack Jews. The 2 decades preceding World War I are known as the Golden Age of Security. According to Arendt, it was called this because, quote, "only a few who lived in it felt the inherent weakness of an obviously outmoded political structure. From Russia to Austria to Germany to France, all faced a growing domestic opposition, but nowhere did they seem to find any political energy to fix these issues." Chesterton is famously quoted in saying, "Everything is prolonging its existence, but denying that it exists." It is this indifference to political change that started to ferment issues like anti-Semitism in the background. While anti-Semitism itself disappeared during this time, Jews became symbols of a society that was marked for hatred, and when the next issue between society and the state would erupt, Jews would be the first one that would be attacked. Now, the Jewish question in its social aspect is much different than in its political aspect, and in this chapter we went over the political aspects of anti-Semitism all the way from the 17th century to the 20th century. Arendt has a lot to write here. I didn't include everything, but if you really like this content and want to learn more, I highly recommend reading the book. In the next chapter, Arendt goes over the social aspects of the Jewish question. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. If you have any suggestions or feedback, please place it in the comments. Thank you.